Good afternoon, everyone. So I will start introducing the IMH webinar today. So today we have Dr. Michael Larkin from Aston University, and this session today will be chaired by Professor Elisa Bortolotti from the University of Birmingham. Before starting, just a reminder of the IMH webinar format. So Dr. Michael Larkin, he will be presenting his work in about 40 minutes, and then at the end we will have all the questions at the end, about 20 minutes. So please write all your questions on the Q&A section in the webinar. And thank you very much, Michael, for accepting to join us, the webinar a long time ago, and then finally it's happening. And also, again, thanks a lot, Lisa, for chairing the session. So now I leave it to both of you. Thank you very much.
Hello, so welcome everybody. As Isabel said, I'm Lisa Bortolotti from the philosophy department, and it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Michael Larkin today. We met a few years ago in an Institute of Advanced Studies event, and a lot of productive things have come out of my meeting Michael. So we have collaborated on a number of projects. We are also co-supervising graduate students, and I find this work really inspiring and motivating. So as Isabel said, Michael is a reader in psychology at the University of Boston, is interested in the notions of well-being and relationships, how they interact with one another, is also a very innovative qualitative researcher, and he has worked a lot on co-production and co-design. Is also one of kind of the founding brains behind the IMH, so we owe him a lot. Last year, December last year, the second edition of the Interpretive Phenomenological Analysis book came out, and Michael is one of the authors. And I think, you know, because of his work on interpretive phenomenological analysis, when he was with us at the University of Birmingham, he was the most cited researcher in the whole university. So I think he has had an incredible influence with their work. At the moment, we are both involved in an interesting project funded by UKRI, and that's on agency in practice, where we look at ways of promoting agency in young people during clinical encounters. In particular, we look at how we can study those interactions together with young people with lived experience. And the project is called Agency in Practice, at least the short version of the title, and it includes people from different disciplines: sociology, psychology, psychiatry, philosophy, and of course, MacPin, which helps us facilitate contact with young people who have had experience of services as well. And I think his presentation is not exactly on that project, because that project just started last month, but it's definitely related to it, and it's about dynamics of interpersonal trust. So Michael, please. Take it away.
Thank you. That's a very nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to be able to do this. And I've picked a paper that is kind of a work in progress. It's under review at the moment, but Zoe, Boden and I have written it over the last 5 or 6 months, passing it back and forward in a kind of relay, gradually figuring out what the argument was. And I thought it would be really useful to hear people's thoughts and questions about it, and inevitably to help us to fine-tune what it is we think we're arguing. So I'm going to talk about trust, because that is what I've been thinking about. I will just get the screen up. Can you see that? Yeah, great. So it is a collaborative paper, and I'm always interested when people write with other people how they do it. So I'll say just 2 things about that, really. That in the past, when Zoe and I have worked together before, we've tended to either sit down at the same keyboard and pass it back and forward and collaborate quite rapidly, or else we've met up for half a day and we've sort of talked it through and hashed it out in some detail and then gone away and written our respective bits. And this wasn't like that at all. We had talked about how a couple of the projects that we've been involved in recent years had got some interesting material in about and on trust, and we talked about that a few times, and then this opportunity came up to think about it and write about it properly, but it came up at a time when we were both really busy, so we were less clear about where we were headed when we set off, and it's been quite interesting to see the thing kind of slightly change direction and change shape as we've gone along. But one of the anxieties that gives me is that there are probably bits of argument and material in there that are kind of hangovers of earlier iterations. So we'll see how it sounds saying it out loud. Got the wrong thing in front of me. That's the one I want. Okay. So where we start is by saying that trust is complex. It has many meanings and many contexts in which it's relevant for us. I think it's worth noticing that trust is usually a kind of risk. There's usually an element of risk involved. There's something at stake when we trust someone. And we do take those risks usually because trust promises us the potential of reciprocity, collaboration, cooperation, things which we think are worth the risk. And that potential, that promise of good things is afforded by other people and by the environments around them. And so when we started thinking about this, our starting point was that trust is relational. It's a relational phenomena. And in a sense, I found it useful to think a bit like a phenomenologist, and to remember that in that sense, trust is an orientation towards other people, and something that happens between people, a kind of entanglement between them. And that it has dynamics, which is one of the things that I'm particularly interested in the context of mental health. So depending on the context of the relationship and depending on the nature of the transaction between the parties in that relationship, the balance of trust will shift. So there's movement, there's change, and as relationships change, so does the location of trust, and the appraisal of what can or cannot be trusted, or of who is not trustworthy with those things. And because, particularly in acute psychological crises, we reconfigure our relationship to all of those things. I think that aspect of the dynamic nature of trust is really interesting and important. So what we've been trying to think about, Zoe and I, is some of the ways in which people orient themselves towards other people in the context of a psychological crisis at a time when, because of that crisis, trust may be under threat, or it might be eroded in some way. So we're interested in the role that the trust plays in the changing balance of relationships. And what we're trying to do in this work is to show how those changes, how those dynamics arise out of particular kinds of contexts, things that are happening in our relationships and environments, and how they call forth effective or evaluative or embodied responses from us. They require us to be continually reconfiguring our position of trust in relation to others. And all of that reconfiguring may well have some consequences for psychological health. And that part seems self-evident to me, but actually I haven't got huge amounts to show you that will persuade you of that in this talk. And I think that's one area that merits more attention and more focused data to demonstrate exactly how the relationship between distrust and distress connect to one another, how they develop. What we've done is we've drawn upon some qualitative data extracts from 2 previously reported studies in order to illustrate and develop our observations in this work. One of those studies I wasn't involved in, and Zoe was. It's a grounded theory study looking at the interpersonal experience of suicidality. It includes interviews with people who had made a suicide attempt, their loved ones, and people who'd been bereaved by suicide. And the other I was involved in, it was a project that Zoe and I collaborated on together, which was about the relational context of early psychosis, what's going on in people's relationships as they cope with a first episode of psychosis. And that involved 10 interviews with young people in early intervention services and a phenomenological approach. One of the reasons for thinking that those 2 sources of data are interesting and worth looking at again is that we don't know very much, actually, when you look at the literature, about the specific phenomenology of trust in relationships when mental health is the context. We obviously do know that connections to others are very important components of people's coping and sometimes of their suffering in relation to mental distress. And so we can speculate that trust is an important part of that. And we obviously do know that seeking help for distress can bring trust and distrust into the foreground. And there is a literature that looks at that, but largely in the context of people's relationships to professionals and services. So talk about trust in relation to mental health is often dominated by valid concerns about how we might want to distrust mental health professionals, hospitals, services, the police, and so on. And we know that there are legitimate reasons for those experiences of distrust, and that the consequences of withdrawing one's trust of those services can also be quite serious. So you may not have access to a place of safety or to a source of support or treatment or to a formal care provider if you don't feel it's safe to trust them. So in the paper, we sort of are trying to bracket that temporarily. We know that that is important, but we also know that it's quite well described. And what we wanted to do was to think a bit more about the interpersonal context of trust and distrust, the affective entanglements around the person. So we think of that as a sort of micro rather than a macro lens, just to think a bit more carefully about what other roles trust might have in people's experiences of distress and their attempts to cope with it. So what we'll try to do, and what I'll try to do in this talk, is show firstly that becoming untrustworthy is intrinsically a relational process, and the next 3 slides cover that. And then secondly, I would like to add to that the observation that trusting others is more difficult when we don't trust ourselves, and that under those conditions, sometimes being mistrustful can be a form of altruism or self-preservation. It can be a helpful thing for us to do. Why is that worth exploring? Well, I think it sets out an important dilemma at the micro level that may also be relevant at the macro level. When we choose to withhold something in a relationship that is founded on trust, that can be a risk to the relationship itself. And we know that relationships can be an important source of coping and support at the micro and the macro level when they're done right. So we want to be able to think about what gets in the way of that. So the first point is simply that connections between people get damaged when trust collapses, and that the withdrawal of trust has got a particular kind of dynamic to it. This is an extract from the suicidality study. It's from an interview with a woman who was bereaved after her husband's suicide. The man was a father and a husband and a well-respected professional. And in the interview, the participant described how in the period prior to his death, his social world shrank and he refused to ask others for any kind of support, help, or care. And that the bereaved woman believed that his inability to trust others was one of the factors that contributed to his suicidality. She says, "I think he had a lot of trust issues from his divorce. We tried to encourage him to take partners in his work, so he'd occasionally have a holiday, but he wouldn't trust anyone. The extra admin stuff he did, it was because one of the receptionists had done it once, got it wrong once, and he decided, right, I'm going to do it myself from now on. That was the kind of attitude he had to most things. He didn't really trust anyone to do anything." So there is a sense in which the mistrust is traced back to earlier events, and the sense of trust having been betrayed previously. And there's a sense of trust under erasure arising out of these previous circumstances. And it seems to have had very serious consequences for the person that we're learning about here. Their social world and the available support are diminished. So from this participant's account, we understand that as the number of people that this man felt able to trust was reduced, so also he withdrew further from the world. And his self-reliance, which had been an effective strategy at some point, actually turned out to leave him more vulnerable. He was exhausted and isolated, we might surmise. And we saw similar kinds of dynamics like this in some of the other examples. And we became interested in the idea that distrust has a kind of momentum to it, a kind of force. And so this is an extract from another participant in the same study who is talking about a time when she had trusted someone at school. The school nurse was my support. She knew about how I felt and she was helping me because she said, "That's fine, you can tell me." But then she phoned my mum and I didn't trust her anymore. So I couldn't talk to anyone after that incident. And so we were struck by the abruptness of that the rules about trusting had been broken. That was it. Here's another participant from the same study. I mean, that's what I find difficult, is because the longer it goes on, the more I feel my family don't trust me, because clearly, because of what I've done before with my family, I find it quite hard because I feel as if I've got to keep that on show, So the sense also that this dynamic works in the other direction, that you may be perceived as decreasingly untrustworthy as well. Logstrop describes trust as a kind of potential. And what we felt we could see here was like a pattern of growing potential for mistrust and decreasing potential for trust. And we wondered how one might reverse that momentum. What would it look like to intervene relationally or more formally in a way that would reverse this momentum? And I don't have a clear answer to that, although clearly have some thoughts about what kinds of things might be helpful, but that's a kind of open question that we think is important. Sorry, I've made the Q&A open and now it's in the way. That's it. Okay. So we're saying that distrust can arise with and from distress, because we're noticing in these data that distress and distrust were often intertwined. They appear to arise together and to grow together. And one of our participants in the early psychosis study, Lakshmi, gave us a very powerful example of that. As she described her first episode of psychosis and the sense of disorientation and confusion and uncertainty that characterized her experiences at that time. And she explicitly positioned trust as being relevant to that sort of sense of becoming unwell, becoming less in control. She says, when you're in that state, you don't know who to trust and who not to trust. It's more a case of trying to find out for yourself. So there's this sense, a bit like in the previous examples, of a person very isolated from the affective and evaluative help of other people. Not knowing who to trust and who not to trust, that's a sort of generalized state of disorientation. And it feels like, in the context of those other examples, that this is a kind of a bid for safety. You know, we'll kind of try to shut down the connections to other people because they may be untrustworthy, they may be dangerous. And we might consider that distrust and distress have similar contextual origins, and it might be useful, I think, for us to think about how the path to rebuilding trust and reducing distress is likely to begin by understanding how the person's world has come to feel unsafe, or what it does feel like, and how the relations within it have come to be untrustworthy, at least in circumstances where those phenomena are important and related for the person. So in those two previous examples, we're trying to draw out the idea that becoming trustworthy is a relational process. It's to do with what's happening with our connections to other people, and becoming untrusting in the same way. This is a very short extract from one of the other participants in the early psychosis study. His name in the study is Manu. He's a young man in his late teens. He'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder after experiencing a first psychotic episode. His father had a similar history and diagnosis and lived away from the family. Manu was the eldest child and lived with his mom and siblings. In his interview, he talked about the changing dynamics of care and responsibility that he'd experienced as a young man growing up in the absence of his father, and how that had changed again in the context of his psychosis and recovery, and particularly how it changed his relationship with his mom. She probably trusted me less. I was more reliant on her, reflecting back on that period. Again, through this period, I was more reliant on her, more dependent on her. And here, a relationship that was previously expected to have developed without incident was being positioned as having gone through a more potentially problematic period. He described how he previously felt like the man of the house and had experienced himself as being trustworthy in the eyes of his mother, as a kind of dependable and responsible person in the house. And since his psychosis, he'd lost his confidence in that sense of agency or power, excuse me. He felt his mum trusted him less and that he needed her more. And I think that is a clue as to the important relationship between care and trust, and how that connection can be disrupted or reoriented during a period of illness, and again, during a period of recovery, as the balance between the trustor and the trustee gets renegotiated, this sense of the shifting location of trust. It's also a nice example because it demonstrates that this kind of phenomena has an affective scaffolding to it, that there's a world which creates possibilities in which trust is connected to things like care and responsibility and role and relationship. So the idea that Manu would be the man of the house because he's the eldest male in it is part of a wider cultural world that Manu's family inhabit, and that we all to some extent inhabit. And so there's an expectation about the future and Manu's trajectory through it that is also shaping his understanding of what's happening in his relationship, and particularly in relation to his mum. Another thing that we noticed is that trusting others is difficult, particularly when one is struggling to trust oneself. And we can, of course, become untrustworthy to ourselves. There's lots of examples of this in the suicidality study. several participants who had previously attempted suicide worried that they could no longer trust themselves as rational agents in their own lives. They spoke about how it had become very challenging to make decisions or take certain kinds of actions because they were often second-guessing their own motives, particularly in relation to other people and their responsibilities towards others. And this sense of relational competence is, I think, really important and relevant. Sometimes it might be competence to complete actions appropriately in the service of other people on other people's behalf. You know, one of the participants spoke about feeling paralyzed simply by having to choose what the right clothes were for her children. And sometimes it might be the competence to keep themselves and other people safe, and, you know, kind of a more higher level sort of responsibility that feels like it's undermined or been shaken by these previous acts. So that the loss of trust in oneself is a thing that many people will speak about. There's a really nice example in the psychosis study where Lakshmi describes at some length experience of, during the episode of psychosis, feeling that she was both unable to trust men and unable to trust herself with men. She had the feeling that something bad would happen if she was around men, and she found it very difficult to disentangle her lack of trust for them with her feelings of becoming untrustworthy to them in her presence. And so she speaks about a time when she's trying to convince her brother to stay away from her because she feels that this is a very dangerous situation. The quote is longer than the one on the slide, but I'll read a bit more of it because I think it's very powerful. When it came to the psychotic period, I was completely, I don't know what it was, but I couldn't be around males. I just couldn't. It was the sense of either I felt unsafe or I felt I might do something that might harm them for some reason. I don't know what it was, but I didn't want to be around them. So I think one night when I was having really very bad symptoms, I managed to get my brother to, because he was home alone with me, I told him to stay away, just to stay away because I didn't want to hurt him. But what happened was he was asking me why? Why do I have to stay away? And he was about 18 or 17, so he understood what was happening to some extent, but he wasn't aware that I was psychotic because no one really knew what was going on for me. But yeah, I managed to push him out of the living room door and I slammed the door shut. And then I was just banging on the door and the door had panes on it, glass panes, and my hand went through one of the panes. And I managed to get a bit of a scar because the glass had shattered and it went in his face, but it wasn't that bad. And I obviously got hurt, but it was more of the sense of how he felt in that situation. I remember, I think my sister told me that he was crying about it. And I was like, I didn't know he cried. And it makes you feel bad in the sense that he had to deal with that on his own. So in an attempt to preserve herself and to keep him safe, she has to push him away. But that also causes distress to both of them. So it's a very difficult situation and a sense of urgency to the situation. And in it, she's trying to keep him safe from her and herself safe from him, or what he represented to her at that time. So it's an act of care that came about in a moment where trust was absent. And I think that's a particularly powerful and acute example of the ways in which functional relationships rely on the presence of some kind of trust, at a minimum, trust that people won't do harm to us and that we won't do harm to them. In a relationship that is mediated by trust, I think sometimes it can be an act of care towards self or towards others to filter and limit the extent of what we entrust to another. And in a sense, we could look at Lakshmi's account of that story about that incident as one example of that. In the context of mental health, there may be an assumption that reduced trust in others represents some kind of clinical symptomology or experience, and that increased trust indicates recovery. And I don't think that simple dichotomy where trusting is good and mistrust is bad is very helpful. There are obviously many instances where not putting our trust in someone is a sensible and adaptive response to the situation we find ourselves in, and where being overly trusting makes us vulnerable, and vice versa. In the psychosis study, there were some examples of where mistrust was tangled up with caring for, loving, worrying about other people. And when we believe that sharing our experience with someone else might lead to their distress, as in Lakshmi's case, we might understandably hesitate from entrusting them with that experience. Similarly, we might do the same if we worry that it will make them reject us or humiliate us or be angry with us. So that there's a range of possible worst case scenarios we might entertain when we withhold our trust around how things are for us. Kerry, who was one of the participants in that study, was a young woman who'd moved away with her from her family to go to university when she had her psychotic experience. And she described being very close to her mum and talking to her mum every day, and yet she'd never told her mum about her psychosis or about being under the care of mental health services. And she'd done this very deliberately. Towards the end of the interview, Zoe, who was interviewing her, picked up on this and said, "You mentioned at the beginning that your mum doesn't need to know about some of the stuff that's happening." And Kerry said, "No, she doesn't. The thing is with my mum is that she would worry, and when she's so far away, I don't need her worrying about me." And so Zoe said, "What do you think would happen if she was worrying?" Kerry said, "She would just, she wouldn't sleep and stuff. And I know she wouldn't eat because she would just be worrying about whether I was okay." And the thing is, the psychosis, that was 7 months ago. So there's no point worrying about her, worrying her about it now. So Kerry wants to protect her mum from worry and the consequences of that she wouldn't sleep and she wouldn't eat, which she predicts would follow this disclosure. And so she's showing care for her mum by choosing not to overburden her, but she's also distrusting her. And we had other examples of this in the study. And sometimes the protection was also about anticipating what might happen to me if I disclose this. And one of the other participants, Jake, gave an example where he was withholding trust or disclosure from others on the basis that he anticipated that their reactions would be unhelpful to him. And that's so in order to protect himself and also to continue to have access to those relationships, which is part of what Kerry is wanting to maintain here. He doesn't share this information. And so I think there's something really interesting and a kind of paradox that's worth noticing here is that, we have to risk the relationship in order to preserve it in some of these particular kinds of situations. We have to say, because we know that when people find they've been distrusted, they may not react well, but we have to kind of measure that against whether it would be better for us actually to not share something, to keep it to ourselves, either for the person or for ourselves. And I think that's interesting. So what I've tried to suggest is that when we look at people's accounts of trust and distrust in the context of mental health difficulties, one of the things that we notice is it seems that the less we are able to trust, the more isolated we become and the fewer opportunities there are available to us to trust and be trusted. And that our ability to trust in ourselves and in others can be undermined by unjust experiences, particularly when professionals betray our trust, as in the example of the school nurse. And in a way, I wonder if we should be thinking about the role that individuals have in terms of deciding and regulating what they share and entrust with others. Respecting people's right to take care of themselves and their relationships in that way seems like an important way of underscoring their human agency, even if we recognize that it's also likely to be a source of some concern in the context of mental health difficulties and the distress and risk that can sometimes go along with those things. So it's complicated. And that's where someone who's better at philosophy than me needs to take this further, I think. I think there's probably some analogy between this interpersonal stuff that we've been looking at through a kind of micro lens and the kinds of things that are happening in the more complex, less equitable context of professional trust. Because in both cases, the person who is struggling can find that their agency has been undercut by someone else if they're not granted authority to decide what to share and when to share it. In a relational context, of course, we can still force an inequitable arrangement. We can say, well, unless you're going to tell me about that, I want nothing to do with you. Or we can say, I'm very upset that you've chosen not to share this with me. So there are things we can do in a relationship that make it difficult for the person not to disclose if we feel there's something that they're not sharing. And of course, the things that services and professionals and institutions can do in those circumstances are more formal and in some ways much more onerous. So I think people should be able to access trustworthy services, obviously, whilst recognizing that services are often underfunded, overstretched, and trust requires a kind of capacity, an interpersonal capacity. We need the space and the psychological resources to trust others and to be trustworthy for them, to honor our commitments, to be competent in the way that we honor them, and to be caring and respectful in the way that we honor them. And I think it's interesting to me that, like, reading around, one of the things that you notice is that appeals to a kind of relational ethics are often seen as the end point of this, that we should be kind, we should be considerate, we should be careful of each other. And of course, all of those things are true. But they are calls to individuals to behave differently. And one of the things I think is that if we want things to be different, we probably have to create structures and environments which are different. And so one of the things I would really like to know more about and to learn more about is how can we create environments and systems which foster and afford trust, which give people the resources and opportunities to be trustworthy and to be trusting. And I think when we design healthcare systems and when we think about services and structures, that is not a question that we are typically asking. So I think for me, that's an interesting place to take this and what I'd like to know more about, really. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this very interesting presentation. There are plenty of questions already, so I'll start with those. First one is, we only have the deceased wife meaning making rather than the person's. Might either microdynamics be at play, such as the feeling of disempowerment and need for control?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the difficulty with anecdotal data. And also, you know, I'm using these examples in a rhetorical, illustrative way rather than presenting a kind of detailed reanalysis of them. So yes, you're right that there is a missing perspective there, in that the deceased person is not available to us to be interviewed. But as you can see from the other examples in that section, we do have some interviews from people who have attempted suicide and survived, and who do have similar kinds of accounts to give. So yeah, that's all I can say, really.
Yeah, so that's That's really interesting, that the use of these particular extracts from people's reports is more of an illustration, isn't it, of something that might happen. It's very difficult to know exactly, what is happening, and without being in this situation or knowing what the other person's perspective is. So Michael, these were Zoe studies, right? The translate. What was the methodology for those? How did they select the people to be interviewed?
So the first one is a grounded theory study.
Yeah.
There are over 40 participants in that. Okay. I would have to go back and read the source papers to be exactly sure about the sampling, but typically with grounded theory, the way that you build a sample is that you are building a theory as you collect the data. And so you're trying to seek out perspectives which will help you to kind of fill in the gaps in your theoretical thinking, or which will answer questions that you're curious about. So rather than setting out at the beginning and saying, we will need this many participants from these many groups, instead you probably start with your core sample, which is likely to be people who have attempted suicide previously, and then you start to think about, what kind of other perspectives do we need? What kinds of bereaved relationship to people who've committed suicide would it be helpful to have based on what we've learned from survivors, for example, and so on. And you would kind of work out like that and until you felt you'd answered your questions.
So it's very bottom up in a way.
Yeah,
you start
very
from
bottom.
People say, and then
And the second study is more like a kind of IPA type study. So it with that, it was much more circumscribed. So we're saying, what is it like to be a young person who has had a first episode of psychosis that has merited the attention of early intervention services, and how do they think about the relationships in their lives during that period? So we were kind of particularly focused on young people who had a first episode of psychosis.
Yeah, no, I think this is quite helpful to put into context those particular narratives, because it's it's not everything that you're basing the reflections on, but it's an important starting point. Good. So the next question was about the kind of basic needs and rights of people who might be in those circumstances, like having suicidal thoughts and so on. So did you notice anything, or the researchers in this case, if it wasn't data that you personally collected, in terms of any circumstances that might have threatened basic needs and rights in those situations that might explain maybe, or be related in some interesting way to mistrust?
I think that's not what's in these particular data sets. But I think there is research that particularly shows how and very consistently, like at the level of systematic reviews, that interventions like coercion and seclusion that withdraw people's basic rights are the source of long-standing sustained mistrust of services, that the negative consequences of these kinds of invasive interventions that withdraw people's rights are really pervasive.
Yeah, that's good. So the next one was about the position of the carer. And the idea was that we are all primed to trust people without question, probably until, like, the principle of charity, version of a principle of charity, until something changes, until the relational and power dynamic shifts. So how can we see the position of the carer in this context? Is he someone that we instinctively trust unless something happens, or do you think that there isn't necessarily that assumption?
Yeah, I don't think there is necessarily that assumption. I mean, developmentally, children learn about deception and counterfactuals and and their humorous deployment quite early in life. And so I think we learn that trust is manipulable, that it's selective, that we have to be careful about where we place it, you know, preschool development. And then actually I think that is further enforced for us in schools, because of the way that schools and nurseries teach about strangers and other kinds of, you know, online safety and all of those kinds of things. So I don't think we are entering into relationships in a kind of natural state of trustingness. I think it's more complex than that. Is a carer in a greater position of trust because of that? So, well, I think it depends what you mean by a carer. And it depends what the historical relationship between the carer and the person being cared for is. You know, if you have a long history that has demonstrated trustworthiness and reciprocity, then that's probably more likely to be something that will carry you through a period of distrust or distress. Yeah. But it can depend on what the nature of the distress is.
Yeah. Let me ask something a little bit different. So you were talking about risk, and I found that quite interesting, because some of the situations that you were describing or using as illustrations seem to suggest almost like the traditional conflict between autonomy, like preserving autonomy. So, yeah, you know, a person should do what they think best when it comes to, you know, their bodies and their health and their relationships. With a kind of more paternalistic approach, where the main aim is to keep people safe, to keep people alive in this context. And these kind of principles, they can come apart. So there may be situations where, you know, you may feel, at least at the time, that in order to keep someone safe, you need to do something that doesn't meet their own interests or preferences or so on. Yeah. So just curious how you see this kind of traditional conflict in the context of trust.
Well, yes, I think it doesn't have to be that it's an either or choice. I think if you create the situation in which a relational ethics can be implemented, which requires being able to, you know, develop and scaffold trust and trustworthiness, then I think you can resolve these dilemmas in a more collaborative way. Many survivor researchers in the mental health movement will point to non-statutory services that manage to do this. You know, it can be done, but it requires a degree of personal commitment and contact, and it requires a degree of flexibility and tolerance of risk, and it also requires a kind of willingness to, well, not a kind of, a willingness to respond to requests for help with meaningful help. Yeah. So, you know, one of the complaints about attempts to sort of introduce positive risk-taking into statutory services has been that they're often used actually to dismiss genuine requests for help by blaming people basically for seeking help and saying, well, it's your responsibility, and that is, you know, that's the opposite of a relational ethics. So yes, I think it doesn't have to be an either or. I think it's possible to come up with collaborative solutions, but they just take more time and personal resources, and that means you've got to develop the capacity and environments for that. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Michael. So a question from Charlotte: how is distrust of the self different from self-doubt? It's a good one.
good question. I wonder if self-doubt focuses a bit more on one's competence to do something. If we have to make a distinction, or in the accounts of self-distrust, it seems almost as if people are questioning their motives. Like, why would I do this? Or what if I do something that is not consonant with who I think I am? How would I make sense of that? Whereas when we experience self-doubt, I think it's more that we are kind of wondering about, oh, am I able to do this? Is this something I'm capable of? Am I the kind of person who does this kind of thing or can do this kind of thing? They're overlapping, you know, but I wonder if there is some sort of distinction that could be drawn out.
Yeah, that's interesting, that self-doubt is more to do with competence, maybe. Another question from Jessica. So she's thanking you for a very engaging presentation. And then she says, I wondered what your view is of the potential for this analysis to inform prevention strategies. You began to touch on this with your closing comments on creating systems of trust. Are there spaces and mechanisms of trust which could be mobilized here?
I think there are some potential candidates, but in a sense, the difficulty that we have with services is a bit like the story about asking for directions, and, you know, I wouldn't start from here. And one can think of interventions that might be helpful, approaches to intervention, which are about relationship building and which foreground the affective and the relational. And so, you know, it's common to point towards things like open dialogue and therapeutic communities and other kinds of network or relationship focused forms of psychotherapy. And those are potentially like localized examples of things that might help. I feel like I don't know enough about what the mechanisms are to suggest what a brand new thing might look like, but I do think that it would involve working with communities of service users to figure out how to configure things differently, and commissioning those things in a kind of collaborative, co-produced way, not simply just trying to change one of the things that a service offers without changing the ethos and structure of the service or the environment. But I also think, and I mean, probably particularly pertinent to Jess, I think that the physical environments in which we do most of this work are awful. I think they do not engender the feeling of being cared for, or as a patient or as a staff member. And so, you know, when you go to porter cabins, when you go to places with torn upholstery, when you go to environments where all the electrical equipment is broken, when you go to environments with locked doors, no daylight, you know, those places do not make you feel like you're in a position where trust is one of the things that is going to mediate your relationship with other people. And so I think the environments are really important. Good. And they're bad.
Yeah, that sounds right. So a different question from Jerry about your notion of trust. So he says, you have seen it as an attribute of a relationship. Could also be helpful to see trust as something that we do in our relationships, something that is enacted on many levels, including through testing out, acts of mutuality or affirmation, and symbolic communication that define context and rules for doing trust.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think it's something that happens between people, and it's something that they do. So yeah, absolutely, Jerry, I agree with that. I think there's a transactional and a performative element to it that is really important. And so rather than simply asking people to be kinder or more considerate, we could think about learning about the kinds of actions that are perceived to be signs of trustworthiness.
Yeah, cool. And the next one is from Kate. Again, she thanks you for your presentation. Trustworthiness and transparency is one of the core principles of trauma-informed practice. Based on your research on trust, does trauma-informed practice appear to be a useful framework or position or approach to this idea of relational trust?
Yeah, I think it definitely fits. I think one of the things that's a bit tricky about talking about trauma-informed work is that the label or the term is used to refer to quite a spectrum of stuff. And some of it, I think, uses the word trauma in quite a loose and unhelpful way that maybe makes some people feel excluded. So I'm not, I think they're good principles. I'm not sure that it's always necessarily about trauma, but I think, yes, building trust really fits with that general approach.
Cool. Next one is from Judy. All of your points resonate with my clinical experience in CAMS. Often my role as a family therapist involves trying to intervene to help families consider how they might reverse the momentum of distrust, thinking about managing emotions, repair, and getting balance of transparency and privacy. I wonder what your thoughts are on the different structures we might need. I like the structure of collaborative helping maps, Madsen, as a way of managing balance of transparency and accountability.
Yeah, I mean, and hi, Judy. It's nice to almost see you. Yeah, systemic work, I think, is a really good precursor of lots of the tools that we need. And you can see its influence on things like open dialogue. So yes, I think you can learn lots from the relevant tools and structures there in terms of what kinds of psychotherapeutic work might we draw upon, and how would we get people in a room to work on those things together. Yeah.
Cool. Another question from Paul. I was reflecting, Michael, of the role of avoidant attachment style and extreme self-reliance in relation to trust, as a person's attachment style would be triggered in emergency situation of mental illness. Wondering if you'd think attachment style of both patient and care staff might be worth considering in relation to micro-trust or trust within systems.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really relevant. And some of the work that's been done by the group at Manchester who are working on attachment in psychotherapeutic relationships would be obviously very relevant here. Yeah, the Fonagy thing, I didn't really mention it in the talk, but I think there's sort of an interesting resonance with this idea of kind of epistemic crisis, where the person is kind of thrown into a situation where new learning is basically put on hold because of the intensity of the affect, and I think that's a sort of plausible sense of what seemed to be happening in some of those data extracts. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think maybe we should stop here because we're almost running out of time. So I'm not sure whether Isabel had a comment or question before we close.
I mean, I think everything is clear, and thanks a lot, Michael, for such an inspiring presentation and very important topic. So yeah, I think it's 1 minute left. So then I think so Lisa, you can close if you want.
Yeah, so there were plenty of questions and very, very big attendance today. So thank you so much. Clearly, lots of people were interested in the topic and that's lots of thoughts to share on it. Sorry, I couldn't read everybody's questions, but we managed to cover quite a few of them. Thank you again for your presentation, which was excellent and very thought-provoking. And yes, lots of clapping hands coming your way.
All right, thank you for having me. It was good to have those questions, and there's lots more to think of. Is it possible to download the Q&A? Can we get a record of that, or is it just go?
We can ask Stacey whether she
Yeah,
can.
if it's possible to read them later, I would really like to read them. I was kind of trying to read and think at the same time.
I'm trying at least to do fast some copy pasting here. So if we don't close, at least I can try to do that.
Okay.
Like very okay.
Fantastic.
All
Thank
right.
you very much, Michael, again.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you a lot, Liz and Michael. And just as a reminder, so it will be, so we will have the recording available, I guess, in a couple of weeks within our IMH website. So thank you all and see you next year. Bye-bye.